Welcome to episode 114 of the Reds Unrestricted podcast. I'm your host, David Comerford, and I'm joined by James Martin to discuss Liverpool's 2-0 Merseyside derby victory over Everton. So finally, something to savour on the podcast. Liverpool winning 2-0 against their local rivals Everton in the Merseyside derby. The scoring was opened by Mohamed Salah at the end of a lightning counter-attack, which had just seen Everton hit the post at the other end. And then early in the second half, Cody Gakpo with his first goal for the club makes it 2-0. And Liverpool able to see it out for the clean sheet and the first Premier League victory of 2023 at last, which only lifts them up to ninth in the table, but certainly makes everything look a little bit rosier. And finally brings us some positivity for the podcast. So I'm joined by James, like I said at the top of the podcast, from Liverpool.com. Thanks very much for coming on, James. We will start in our usual fashion with our 3-word match review. So if you give me what you've got for that, and also just your assessments of Liverpool's general performance yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there was only one place to go with the 3-word summary. Yeah, thanks for having me on, by the way. That'll be Bajcetic, real deal. I mean, it was a proper coming of age performance, wasn't it? I mean, it's hard to call it that in a way because he's already looked so good in the last 4 or 5. But to be thrown in the derby, and he kept his place even with Fabinho and Henderson coming back, and he was the best of the three, and that's despite Fabinho and Henderson looking a lot closer to their best as well. But yeah, this teenage kid was just running the show. He was snapping into tackles. He was making interceptions. He looked better on the ball than we've seen him before. It was a new position for him, sort of a number 8 role. And yeah, he excelled, given that he was a centre-back not so long ago with the youth teams, and then he's just been told to have a go at number 8 in like you say, such a significant fixture, not just because it's the derby, but because of the situation in the league. This really needed to be a win just for everyone's sakes, and it was, and it was largely down to him.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and we'll talk a little bit more about Bajcetic in a second because he was, by all accounts, the man of the match last night. But in terms of my review, I've gone with victory to savour, kind of picking up on what I said in the opening of the podcast. I spoke last week about how I'd kind of put my expectations to one side in light of what was happening this season, and was just kind of looking for the games where you could take those kind of really satisfying victories and those moments that kind of remind you why you actually know football, which this season has obviously been very difficult. And yeah, this was kind of one of the games that you earmarked for that, and I thought it was I don't think it was a vintage Liverpool display by any means. I think, I've seen a lot of people saying Liverpool are back to their best. I think this was a different version of Liverpool than that. I think it was more about, certainly in the first half, it was more about the fight and the intensity and those kind of intangibles that we've been missing. I think there wasn't really a moment of quality from Liverpool until Nunez plays the 1-2 with Salah and then plays the ball into his path in the box. And obviously we get the goal from that. And then I thought the second half performance was really good. It was much closer, but I think, yeah, it was for me just about kind of the catharsis of it. And I think the fist pumps from Klopp at the end kind of sum that up. I mean, we all needed that one really. But to return to Bajcetic, like I said, you kind of touched on it there, James. He's obviously come into the team as a number 6. Fabinho starts here. Obviously, no Thiago out for a month. How did you think he fared in that more advanced role in the midfield? And I mean, we've got limited evidence, but do you think there's a possibility that it might suit him better?
I mean, all things considered, I think he did exceptionally well. I mean, like we say, there was consensus that he was man of the match. I think, if we're being completely honest, there were moments where you could tell he hadn't played number 8 before, even though he was so good. There were, moments where he maybe carried the ball forward, had a few options, and wasn't quite sure which one to pick out. But you can't criticise him for that. That comes with time. Like I say, he was a centre back not that long ago, so Joel Matip's also a centre back. He has a knack for picking the right passes, but it's a specific skill set, and it can only come with practice, really. So, yeah, like you say, it's very early to say whether it'll suit him better than the number 6. And I do think some of his best contributions here were still those kind of snapping into tackles. I think he won 2 tackles, maybe a couple of interceptions as well. So a lot of his best work was still that defensive work. But then, especially in the Liverpool system, you do need that defensive work from the number 8s as well. So, yeah, I mean, if he can be moulded into this sort of player who has the sort of requisite offensive qualities to make a difference going forward from that role, while also providing a bit more of that stability, then yeah, it's a win-win really. But equally, he's been our best player. Salah said after the game he's been our best player in the last few matches, and that's been from the number 6 role. So, you know, particularly if the recruitment drive in summer does focus on number 8s, you look at the big names who have been linked that they do tend to be number 8s. That then maybe Bajsetic's long-term future is back at the number 6 as a sort of Fabinho successor. But yeah, it's nice to know that the option's there.
Yeah, that interview with Salah was brilliant. I think the way sort of his face lit up and the way you could tell how much it meant to him. You know, he said Salah was one of the best Liverpool players ever, and to receive that kind of compliment from him was certainly a joyful moment. And I think, you know, with Bajsetic and the whole position thing and the transfer market really in general, you're looking at a player who you hope can save you a lot of money within that. And, you know, if he does settle down as a number, it doesn't necessarily have that effect, I don't think, because then you still need to kind of address maybe the Fabinho situation that we've seen this season. So I think in an ideal world, he kind of does kind of become that specialist number 6 and can be sort of competing with or even starting ahead of Fabinho as we move forward, whilst still being able to play the number 8, because then you've got the added versatility too. So I think that'd be how I prefer it to pan out. So I think in terms of his performance last night, for me, you look at kind of young players when they break through, and you want kind of these kind of seminal moments, you know, the milestones in their career, the games where you think that they are special. And I think we saw quite a few of those with Trent Alexander-Arnold. I mean, I think back to his free kick against Hoffenheim in the Champions League qualifier, and probably more so within that kind of first breakthrough season, his performance against Leroy Sané against Manchester City in the Champions League quarterfinals. And you know, we're not talking about the same caliber of opposition here, but we're talking about a fixture that does mean a lot. And for Bajsetic to produce a man of the match display, I think is absolutely huge. And if the excitement around him was, you know, already quite high, I think it's also going to overdrive in light of that. And it's important to still kind of keep a lid on expectations for now. But yeah, it is really difficult to it's really difficult not to be very excited about this player, because it looks like we've kind of got our next academy breakthrough, and hopefully can kind of sustain the trajectory that he's on. Another player who was one of the stars of last night was Cody Gakpo. Like I say, he scored his first Liverpool goal. How timely is that, James? Because we've seen Firmino and Jota, and another kind of overlooked positive from last night, returning to the team as substitutes. Has he done enough now to keep his place in the side after maybe some more difficult games in the early part of his Liverpool career?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I suppose you could say it's not particularly timely. You'd rather the goals have been coming when there was no Jota and Firmino waiting in the wings. But you know, it's a horrible situation to come into. Liverpool weren't performing well, and there didn't seem to be any particularly clear idea where Gakpo would even be playing. We assumed he'd come in and play on the left wing, with Jota out, with Diaz out, and with Nunes back. But that hasn't been the case. I thought it was very brave of Klopp to sort of persist with that. I mean, there was lots of rotation within the game, but you know, essentially it was Gakpo through the middle again, Nunes out wide. It would have been easy to switch that in light of results going badly, in light of that being, you know, an obvious change to make. But ultimately, Nunes was kind of terrorising Everton. Seamus Coleman. I mean, it wasn't Coleman for the opening goal. I think it was Idrissa Gueye who was tracking back over on that side. But that sort of burning pace down the wing was a real weapon. And then, of course, Gakpo, like you say, pops up with the goal, just almost a poacher's goal, really, in the right place to knock it in from close range. So that worked very nicely. And yeah, in one sense, it definitely is timely, because you could tell that he needed it. He's even talked about that in interviews. He's been very open that, you know, he's an attacker. Of course, he wants goals and assists, and it bothers him when he doesn't get them. And I think you could almost see that weight being lifted. I mean, he was good before the goal as well, but I felt we saw more of an expressive player after that goal. We saw him maybe take on players a little bit more. We saw a bit more of the player we'd sort of got excited about on the PSV highlights reels. So, yeah, I think it can only be good for him, and competition can only be good for the team. So much as it gives Klopp a bit of a dilemma going forward, it's a nice dilemma to have.
Yeah, I'm still not sure what I kind of think of the whole, Gakpo through the middle, Nunez out wide. It does feel like players being played away from their kind of specialist roles. But I am intrigued to see how Gakpo develops in that side of the game. I mean, he spoke in his interview with Sky yesterday about, dropping in and being that link player. And it seems like Klopp really has identified him as the player he wants to be, the Firmino successor in a stylistic sense. So it'd be interesting to see how he evolves and whether he can kind of be aware the air. So Firmino has obviously been kind of one of the leaders in that field, if you like, really, with that false nine role. But those moments, I think, where he did it against Brighton as well, where he picks up the ball and he's able to drive forward, are really encouraging in terms of, I don't even know if it comes down to pace, to power, to close control, but it shows that, he has got that side to his game as well. And I think even though he hasn't been able to score before last night, there have been some positive performances from him, and now to kind of get a goal to cap that off, hopefully we see a sustained run now of goal involvement, because, like you say, that is what he certainly values and what Liverpool need from him. And I do think he's done enough now to hold on to his place until such a point where he maybe has a couple of poor games and then somebody else can come in, or when rotation allows. So that is, like you say, the dynamic you want in the squad, and hopefully it lasts, because the injury problems have been so extensive this season that you just want to be able to feel the benefits of your depth for a while at least. And yeah, certainly if I could have chosen some players to score last night, I think Gakpo would have been probably at the top of the list for those reasons. But let's talk about some other players who stood out. Who would be kind of your honourable mentions, James?
I think Nunez. I touched upon him. I flag him up. I thought he was very good, like we say, in that position, which neither of us are quite sure on yet. I think I do still slightly prefer him through the middle, but every performance like that makes you maybe reevaluate, makes you think, okay, maybe Klopp knows what he's doing here, because he did look very lively. He, of course, got the assist from that wide position, and he looked dangerous cutting inside as well. There was that one which he curled just wide of the post, and then I think one or two fairly tame efforts, but on target at least. So yeah, he's maintaining his threat wherever he plays across the front line, which I suppose is the main thing. Klopp's always liked a versatile forward, so yeah, I think he did well. Salah, we need to talk about as well. I think he was another level, really, certainly compared to where we've seen him recently. I think as well, what was sort of underrated was that he was actually getting free kicks, which is so rare. It was the first half alone he got 4, which is more than he's got in any game since joining Liverpool in the Premier League. That was a nice snippet from Andrew Beasley, I think, on Twitter. I'm not sure if he picked up any more free kicks in the second half or not. I can't remember any, but yeah, I mean, he should be getting that number sort of every game. Defenders are all over him, and when it's properly penalised, it helps, because defenders have to stop getting so tight to him. They have to try and defend him properly instead of just fouling him all game. And with that extra half a yard of space, he can do excellent things. I thought he was really good. Obviously, for the goal as well, he was keeping up with Nunez, which is an achievement in itself. And then Pickford made the finish easier than it might have been. But yeah, I thought he was very good with his all-round game, not just the goal. I suppose we should probably mention Henderson and Fabinho just briefly. Fabinho was still half a yard off the pace in moments. He committed a couple of fouls. Bajcetic, I think, got through the whole game without committing a foul. So I suppose there was a bit of a contrast there, but equally it was levels above where he's been in recent performances. It's poles apart from the horror show at Brighton when he came on in the last 10 minutes or so. So yeah, credit to both of them. Henderson, I think Klopp called him a one-man pressing machine or something after the game. He certainly put in the hard yards. So yeah, good from them. I think probably those are the ones I'd pick out. I suppose Robertson, for his moment with Pickford, has to be mentioned at the end. Yeah, that was sort of the thing that summed it up for me. It's like, this is a step towards the Liverpool we know and love. With when Robertson is taking the mickey out of Pickford, laughing his head off at 2-0 up in the derby. It just, yeah, it felt right. And he played very well as well, as did Trent on the other side. It's hard to pick people out. I'm just going through the whole team at this point, because I think it was so much improved from everyone. But yeah, those are probably the standouts.
Yeah, but I was going to make a point along similar lines. I think in terms of, there's certain games where there maybe isn't, maybe by Cedric side, but there maybe isn't a player who's kind of 9 out of 10, but you get kind of like 7, 8 out of 10 across the board. And then in those scenarios, it's like you can kind of just recognize what kind of each player brought to the table to produce what was collectively a really strong performance. And yeah, that Robertson moment was like, was kind of the Merseyside derby comedy that you really want. I mean, we always get something in those games that beat Everton. You think back to last year when Alisson, dived on the ball and things like that. It's those moments where you just feel like, regardless of the adversity that Liverpool might face, they will always kind of be able to trump Everton. And yeah, I think just generally with Robertson, it's like he had the air for me from the very start of the game of just desperation, but in a good way. Not in terms of allowing things to get out of control. I tweeted that I don't think there was any player who wanted those 3 points more on that pitch than Robertson yesterday. And that moment in the lead up to the second goal where he just drives past those players, I was stunned. I know Robertson's quick, but it's been a while since we've seen that kind of burst of pace from him. And there are almost moments where he looked like he did in that 4-3 win over City in 17-18, just in terms of being so energized and just absolutely relentless. And it was one of his best moments of the season, that run, even if it didn't directly lead to an assist for him. And in terms of other players, I mean, you mentioned a couple there. Nunez, really good performance from him. I mean, it's important to have a striker who can contribute all round, as much as you want him to be kind of that out and out number 9 goal scorer. The reality is he is going to need to contribute when he can't score goals as well. I think Nunez is showing that he can do that, which is obviously really important. Salah too, we've got to kind of give him his credit. We've obviously talked about him a lot in terms of what's going wrong, but to have 18 goals still in mid-February, this could still easily be touching a 30-goal season for Salah, and in the circumstances that would be a huge achievement for him. So I think that kind of puts everything in perspective. I mean, other players, Trent's obviously getting an assist. I thought it was telling that Sky put up a graphic at the start of the game saying 1 assist in his last 25 Premier League games or something like that. And you just think to yourself, as much as we know Trent has been out of form, that graphic almost shows in itself how he's changed the standards for fullbacks. Because in the past, that might have been the rate at which, good fullbacks were getting assists, and now it's expected to be a lot more. But yeah, obviously the cross that caused confusion, put it on a plate for Gakpo as well, so that was great to see. I thought Gomez had a good game. I mean, I won't get too carried away with that, because it feels like, every time he plays really well, we get a bit excited, and then he has a game where it's 2 steps back. But he's been inconsistent this season, but credit where it's due for yesterday. I thought he was very, very solid. Especially, given that Everton almost targeted him with their style of play. We know Gomez is probably the weakest of our defenders when it comes to aerial duels. But I think he kind of held his own in the physical sense as well. So those would be probably the players that I'd pick out from last night. And just to add on Gomez, I think he's probably done enough, with Kanate still being out a little bit longer, probably. He's probably done enough to keep his place ahead of Matip, with Van Dijk now back on the bench, which is, again, another thing we should probably mention from last night, that we had Van Dijk waiting in the wings. I mean, his only involvement in the game was running down the touchline for that obligatory Merseyside derby scuffle. But yeah, it was good to see him back nonetheless. But just to wrap things up then, James, obviously there's a lot of talk about this potentially being a turning point for Liverpool, given that, it's a victory over your local rivals. It's one that means a lot, and the performance was really good too. I mean, do we have to approach that with a degree of skepticism, given that it is only one game, and given that we have seen previously in the season games which have looked like they could, ignite Liverpool, and then it's almost been back to square one within a couple of weeks?
I mean, yes and no. Like, I wouldn't necessarily say skepticism, because I mean, Klopp was clear after the game, wasn't he, that he genuinely thinks the Anfield crowd made such a big difference. The fact that they were up for the game, the fact that they were sort of so positive from the first whistle, and even, it could have been easy for, sort of mood of unease to set in. There was that sort of Matip error, wasn't there, early on, which I thought he recovered from very well, by the way. He had a good game after that, but there were those moments when maybe the tide could have turned, but it was just a barrage of support, and that does transmit to the team. So I think there's an element of being a supporter. Obviously, you're allowed to be realistic. You're allowed to be upset when things are going badly, and there's been no dressing up performances in the last few weeks. They've been awful, but equally, where's the fun of it if you can't hope? If we put in a performance like that in a derby and you think, well, we're just going to be rubbish again next week, well, that's no fun for anyone, is it? So, if I have my realistic hat on, then yeah, of course you've got to maybe be a little bit cautious with it. It could be that we go to Newcastle next and put in a horrible performance, and then it's back to square one. But I like to believe that won't be the case. That this can be the start of a good run, and there's a lot still to play for. We're only barely over the halfway mark, which seems bizarre, but obviously with the World Cup break, the schedule's a bit thrown off. So there's still so much to play for. You look at other teams above Liverpool stumbling, and you think, well, yeah, why not? We've seen this Liverpool side, almost this exact Liverpool side, in fact, put together historic runs in the not too distant past. So, yeah, I mean, it's hard to see it happening again, but if it does, then why not? Top four could be on. We're still in the Champions League. That's massive. It's obviously a replay of last year's final. So, yeah, lots to be excited about, and I think that performance gives us all a right to be excited instead of just nervous.
Yeah, definitely, and I think your answer there almost shows the power that a victory like that can have in terms of changing the mood, really, because the contrast with what it was after sort of that Wolves game is clear. But you do kind of like look through the season, you see games like the 9-0 over Bournemouth, 2-1 against Ajax, the 7-1 over Rangers, beating Man City, literally, just scrolling through the results, and even the victory against Tottenham before the World Cup, things like that. And you just think each one of them, you've been like, okay, this is Liverpool starting to look more like what we expect from them, and then they regress. So the key is now to sustain it, because if it is just a flash in the pan, then we will go nowhere. And really, it comes down to away form, I think, because at Anfield, I think we've actually been broadly pretty decent this season, but we've got this horrendous away record. You mentioned how we harnessed the crowd yesterday. How do we kind of transfer that to away from home, where the crowd's going to be on top of us in the other way, really? So that, I think, is broadly speaking the key for Liverpool if they are going to make a run and at least give themselves a chance of qualifying for the Champions League. I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because we could have been talking about a game that went very differently. Everton hit the post, and I think there was sort of 18 seconds before it goes in at the other end, and you almost don't want to consider how it might have played out, had that goal gone in, because we know the kind of tactics Everton would have used. We know how it might have affected, the mood and confidence of the team. So football's a game of fine margins. They went Liverpool's way on this occasion. So you got to be sort of cautious from that standpoint, but definitely a lot to take from it in terms of, in terms of optimism. And I think the added thing here is, like we've kind of mentioned throughout the podcast, we have got players coming back now, and if that kind of continues in the right direction in terms of the numbers, coming back towards a full complement, then it could make a material difference. You talk about putting a run together. I think that is a crucial ingredient of that. And yeah, I mean, Anfield yesterday, I wasn't at the game, but based on what Klopp was saying, based on what you could almost hear through the television, sounded like it really got behind the players. And I think if we can kind of harness kind of an underdog mentality, like a defiant mentality, then it could be something that really does transmit to the players. But yeah, that will about wrap us up for this episode. Thanks very much to James for coming on. I'll put the link to your Twitter in the episode description, and you can read James's writing on liverpool.com. So yeah, satisfying to see that Everton can't beat Liverpool, even in potentially Liverpool's worst ever Premier League season. So hopefully you've enjoyed a more positive episode of Reds Unrestricted. If you're listening on Spotify or an audio platform, remember to follow the podcast so it comes up in your feed, and please give it a positive rating or review. And we're also uploading podcasts to YouTube as well, so you can watch them in video form. Like, comment, subscribe, all those things if you are enjoying it. And yeah, we will see you next time to reflect on the game against Newcastle. But until then, take care.